Are homeschooled kids weird? Is free speech just a marketing ploy for U.S. citizens? And is the whole point of the Republican Party just to serve the rich? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds, find takes, social media posts that we find interesting, and we try and pick apart whether we think they're good or bad. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie, and before we get started, please make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one is from Brian Nichols. And he's posting a meme on X, and it writes, in 1993, it said, "Don't homeschool, they'll be weird." Fast forward to 2023, kids in public school identifying as cats, dogs, and barn animals. Fellow homeschooler Donnie, what do you think about this take?
You know, I think that the "don't homeschool, they'll be weird," that was not, it's not totally wrong in the sense that there was a good chance that you could identify a homeschooler if they were amidst peers of their age who were not. Now, whether or not you could identify them because of good or bad reasons is definitely up for debate. Now, sometimes there definitely were some people who you felt, oh, you're a homeschooler, and that was derogatory. But the other thing was that that's not always true, and that wasn't always the case. And it feels like the longer time goes on, the more superficial that kind of critique is. Because maybe the weirdness kind of peaked in middle school when that kind of thing matters. Your popularity matters and everything is a cliquey and again, very shallow because you're children. That's where it feels like the height of this critique maybe resonated. But on the other side of it, it seems like now homeschooled kids, even the ones who were weird, are way more adjusted and prepared and ready and skilled in all kinds of different metrics. Compared to counterparts. And, you know, it's not saying that these people are better than public schooled kids, but it is saying that when you can homeschool kids successfully, you're just going to get a lot of the natural benefits of low teacher to student ratio. You're going to have individualized curriculum that keeps up with that child's speed rather than having to wait for the slowest member of a group. There's so many benefits to homeschooling besides even just the cultural rot that the public schools are, that I would argue, so many public schools are bad. But even if you're just talking about a great public school that has no compounding issues with it being a publicly run government school, even those suffer from things like, a lot of students and beholden to government curriculum and all kinds of barriers to that teachers aren't able to overcome, even if they are a very bright, intelligent, and aspiring teacher who has great ideas. There's a lot of barriers for them to be able to do the ideas that they want to do. Whereas in homeschooling, that's usually not the case. When it comes to individual attention, your parents are much more equipped for that kind of thing. Yeah. When it comes to pooling resources, there are all kinds of associations that are willing and eager and ready to pool for larger things like field trips or other kinds of socialization projects. So if there was any merit to this critique about homeschooled kids being weird, I feel like those critiques were the most relevant when your kids are like in middle school. And if that's the price you pay to not have kids identifying as cats and going on all kinds of bizarre government funded ideologies that are driving people apart, I would say that's a pretty good trade.
Yeah, this made me think of and it's going to seem like way out of left field, but when a music artist goes under contract to play at a venue, or like my band used to try and book other bands at local venues in our area to hop on and open for them. It was a good strategy, but they'll send this thing called a rider, which has like a list of all the things that the artist requires when they show up. And it's like, hey, we don't eat dairy, so if you're going to have pizza, make sure there's like a vegan cheese or whatever. But sometimes buried deep within the rider, and it's kind of known industry-wide as the green M&M clause, which is they have green, specifically, we need to have a bowl full of green M&Ms. And the reason they have that in the rider is so that one, either the person that's booking them is like, hey, is that really necessary? Or two, like they show up and there are no green M&Ms, like the artist knows now whether or not the person that hired them actually read through the contract. And I think that like with public school and homeschooling, that like these kids being identifying as cats and dogs and barn animals and being weird and doing all this stuff is a symptom of parents not paying attention to what's going on. And any weird homeschooler, it's the same thing, right? Like I actually know homeschoolers that have some of the same issues that public school kids are seeing. But you know what the common denominator is in that is that there are parents that weren't paying attention. But the beauty about homeschooling is that it forces parents to make sure that they're paying attention to their kids in most cases. And there are some homeschool families that are like very much like unschooled, or it's like, hey, we're not actually going to teach any curriculum. We're not going to pay attention. We're just going to let kids kind of be and do. And yeah, they'll have a list of chores and all that stuff. And those kids generally would turn out weird. And there's always like this weird definition, not weird, but a true definition of like homeschooled. Like I'm a kid and I'm homeschooled versus a homeschooler, which is I'm homeschooled and I like can be identified as a homeschooler because I'm kind of weird and quirky and can't socialize. But I think that this entire system that we have set up, where you've got a government that is trying to, and we see it every day, trying to separate kids from their parents, put up walls between parents and their kids, make the rights that parents have over their kids in school about what they learn, about what they are taught, about what they are actually exposed to continues to be, you know, the gap continues to be widen. It just continues to incentivize parents to not have any say, have not any attention on what their kids are doing. And that, I think, has more, regardless of whether it's public school or homeschooling or some other type of educational program, parents paying attention to what their kids are doing, having a vested interest in making sure that they're being raised in a good way is the common denominator to having well-adjusted new human beings. You could choose any sort of system, and if a parent's not doing that, they're going to turn out fairly weird. I just think that the systems within the public school system incentivize not paying attention because they're like, well, I just want to, you know, I got my kid from from birth to 5 years old, and now I'm sending them off to school, and now I've got my afternoons back, you know, and that's how the attitude a lot of parents take. And that's the type of attitude that public school incentivizes. And of course, kids are going to be open to hostile philosophies if that's the mindset that you have for raising them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you, as a parent, are absent from informing your children, paying attention to them and interacting with them, shaping them, that's a vacuum that's going to be filled by something. And that is where the government schools really will take advantage. Again, intentionally or not. I don't think every single public school teacher intentionally goes in and thinks, I'm going to turn this child against their parent. But every government school teacher does have their own biases, has their own worldview, has their own perspective that they're going to be teaching from, they're going to be instilling. And frankly, the entire posture of a government school says we are going to allow a certain range of morals and values that this government school recognizes as good, and we are going to reject ones that we do not agree with. And so the government school, again, regardless of the teachers themselves, has its own Overton window of allowable views that teachers can impress upon students. So even in the best case of a student, or excuse me, a teacher who shares maybe a worldview that you as a parent want your child to have, they're very strictly limited from actually being able to share that in many cases, right? So you're only getting what the government school wants to be impressed upon the kids, regardless of the range of teachers you have, although many of the public school teachers are very ready and willing to radicalize your students or their students and your children. So when, as a parent, you are absent, then yeah, whether you're homeschooled or public schooled, you absolutely are going to end up with a student who's weird or acting out in certain ways because of a lack of attention. But the reality is, when they're in a public school, it's almost always going to be much more potent and weaponized as well. That's the other thing. I think in the case of homeschooled kids, I think you might get normal rebellion, you might get normal cultural adoption of what is important, but I think in the public schools it's almost a guarantee. And so yeah, even with the weird homeschool kids, I think that there's probably less of a chance that they end up thinking quite as uniformly as maybe some of their counterparts would, because in the public school, not only are you taught with these particularly hostile ideas sometimes or not, but more than not, you are taught to think uniformly. So even if you have a weird homeschooler who's somewhat neglected, the chances are, even if they rebel against you in the most poignant ways they can, they're going to be somewhat of an independent thinker. And I can think of friends of mine, people who I like very much, a mutual friend of ours, who really did not like their homeschooling upbringing, and yet is still a super sharp and independent thinker, even if they rebelled in specific certain ways from certain age demographics, right? Yeah. He's still extremely sharp, extremely smart, and thinks for himself, and kind of came around to some of the great worldviews on his own, in spite of maybe an upbringing that he, again, tried to rebel against.
Cool. Sorry, I've been dropping out a little bit, but I'm back now and good. So
you're good.
Let's move on to the next one. All right. We've got Geiger Capital, and they are tweeting out an Elon Musk quote. It's from a New York Times interview that he did. And they write, Elon called out the fake corporate virtue signaling and ESG BS. Quote, what I care about is the reality of goodness, not the perception of it. And what I see all over the place is people who care about looking good while doing evil. Screw that. That's Elon Musk talking. What do you think?
I think that's a great perspective. I think it really, I mean, he's in a position where, as far as advertisers on Twitter are concerned, his back is against a wall to some degree. So you can say, oh, it's easy for him to say that he's already lost everything. But the reality is he still runs Tesla. He still has other business ventures in mind. I would assume he still's got SpaceX. So to even speak that frankly and boldly is a great thing. I wouldn't say that this message is even that particularly nuanced or deep, but the bravery it takes to say this and to call it out in front of a lot of the people who are perpetrating this, that takes guts and bravery. And I have nothing but respect for him for saying as much. In particular, calling out, I think the ESG stuff in particular, anything where the ostensible good is supposed to be diversity, it's supposed to be equity, and all these kinds of traits. The broader narrative is that these are just by default good, and if you're not actively going for them, you are an evil person. This is perhaps the biggest area where Elon's quote really applies, which is to say, all I see people who care about looking good while doing evil. And I mean, again, you'd see that. I would argue that, in a sense, if you're an employer and you have two candidates and one is more well qualified for your job than the other, but you hire the other person in order to satisfy some diversity quota, I would argue that is trying to look good while doing evil, because you are actively hurting someone who has worked hard and done something worthy of this job promotion in order to cover your own skin. It's again, at best, cowardice, and at worst, maliciousness or pride, or any number of things that are about self-aggrandizement. So more than even the reality of his quote being true, I think that the context and the position of life he's in, he does have some security because he's quite wealthy. So that is true. But usually people who have that wealth are in positions where they feel they can't speak out because they're beholden to so many people. So good for him.
Yeah, it was honestly, if you haven't watched the entire interview yet, it's fantastic. And it's just a really courageous effort by Elon. And like you were saying, like Elon Musk his back might be against the wall with Twitter in some way or form or fashion. I think that probably is going to survive. But like you were saying, he's got other ventures out there, right? So he's going to be fine. But there is something courageous about seeing someone that has the true definition of screw you money actually stand up and say, hey, you're evil and wrong, and I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. And it reminded me of, I think this was probably about a year ago, where Elon kind of like flipped over the table and posted his entire text exchange with Bill Gates, because Bill Gates had been criticizing him about, climate change and, making sustainable stuff. And then Bill Gates reached out to Elon about like, hey, I want to meet and talk about how we can partner on this and that. Mm-hmm. And Elon's like, hey, like, don't you have like a $5 billion short against Tesla stock? Like, I'm not going to talk with you until you, stop that. And for those of you who are not versed in like financial stuff, basically Bill Gates had betted against Tesla succeeding, the world leader in electric car vehicles being built and everything. And so that was his entire point here too, was like, he's like, hey, look, like people say they value climate, agendas, they value sustainable energy and all this stuff. Like no one is doing anything more for that than Tesla and me, by proxy, by running that company. No one is advancing our knowledge of like of outer space and things other than Elon Musk, and yet somehow people are criticizing him, and it just makes you realize that like these people really do what he's saying. They only do care about looking good. They don't actually care about doing what's good. They only care about whether you are lock in step with their agenda and if you are useful to them. And that's how you've seen like with what's so interesting with like the entire the situation in Israel right now, or with the COVID stuff. Like you had people on both sides of the political spectrum. Like I think about like Glenn Greenwald and Ben Shapiro, or Jimmy Dore and Dave Smith, like opposite sides of the political spectrum, but like both valuing truth and like both agreeing on the destination is like, we want to know what's actually going on, eventually reaching the same conclusion. Maybe not with Israel and Ben Shapiro, but you get what I'm saying with some of this other stuff. And like all of them kind of blacklisted, right? In the same way, the same vitriol that applies to Dave Smith also applies to Jimmy Dore, even though they're like supposedly on opposite teams. And that's the same thing with Elon Musk. It's like, hey, this guy actually, in terms of like your life philosophy of like saving the world through climate agenda and all these different types of things, like he's on that team, or at least practically speaking, he's doing more for that agenda than anyone else in the agenda that they purport, which is like, we want to be sustainable. But he's really not on like the actual, like, hey, we want everyone to be in lockstep and we want to limit your energy usage and we want to have rolling blackouts and all this stuff. He's for more freedom and the more you can be sustainable and also drive your car too, and have all these other luxury goods as well. And for some reason, there are folks that don't appreciate that because it doesn't really jive with the authoritarian mandates that are coming down, which is really just about limiting your personal freedom from top to bottom. And so therefore he's an enemy. Yeah. So he to me, he looks good and he's also doing good, which is I think the best of all worlds.
Yeah. Well, and to the point you were saying just a second ago about, this idea of like, oh, the people who are trying to pursue the truth getting blacklisted and things like that. The way that they're getting blacklisted was also this exactly in this lockstep of looking good while doing evil. When you look at the different communications that have come out, Michael Schellenberger had testified the other day before Congress about more of these internal documents that he had got that were leaked to him from government officials that were trying to censor social media companies. They were talking about censoring content that was factually true, but promoted maybe false actions. Like they were worried about true facts that people were posting, encouraging behavior that they would say would be false behavior. So for instance,
false behavior. Wow.
Right. Like things like we have to ban this Facebook group of vaccine injured people because this will discourage people from taking the vaccine. And so let's, again, for a moment, let's assume that there are no abnormalities with the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. Let's assume that it's just totally like any other vaccine. They're saying we should silence the people who are talking about real vaccine injury that happened to them, which is true of any potential vaccine, right? Because it might convey a hesitancy for people to take this because that would give a false impression of the vaccine. And so, again, it's about looking good while doing evil, silencing people, silencing the truth in order to look good. Again, here one more. I'm always going to talk about local politics here when I can. Another great example, a King 5 report just broke out that an economist for the Washington State Department of Ecology said that he felt pressured and forced to resign when he, as an economist for this department, wouldn't change the numbers that affirmed what Washington Policy Center calculated and what basically their own numbers said, which was that this new cap and trade tax was going to raise gas prices by about 44 cents. The numbers and the data they provided shook out to that. And he said, basically, I felt like they were pressuring me and I was forced to resign because I wouldn't change my numbers to say that this would, I was going to come out and say, this is going to raise prices by 44 cents. Again, so they're like, we are worried about people being mad and blaming us about increased gas prices, so we need to silence him in order to look good, but we're doing evil. There's so many examples of this, even like trying to tear down the lower Snake River dams in Washington, the people who purport to claim to really oh, we really care about electric and renewable energy and all that kind of stuff. We want to remove the number one clean energy source in Washington state because it will marginally help salmon, even though it would cost $35 billion. And you could spend that federal money, even if you want to spend the federal money, on other projects to help recover salmon. So it's always about looking good, and always whenever you're more concerned about looking good than the truth, you will end up doing evil. That's just how it works.
Oh, that's a great quote. I like it. All right, let's move on to the next one. Is this the comment one?
This is a comment.
All right, perfect. So Donnie was a guest on, what was the show?
I think it's called Indisputable with Dr. Richie
on the Young Turks.
Yeah, and it's got a segment called The Bullpen.
Yeah, and he did a great job, and I encourage all of you to go take a look at it. But they were talking about social media company censorship of conservatives and people just in general. And this person commented on the video, writing, "Twitter did censorship under the request of President Trump. Biden wasn't even president when his campaign requested Hunter Biden's nude pics be taken down, which was according to Twitter's own policy. Elon Musk has done censorship numerous times at the request of various governments around the world. Quote, free speech is simply a marketing ploy for the U.S. audience." What do you think?
This is one of the most you're missing the point takes I've seen in a long time. Like, regardless of even the conversation we had, which this totally, again, misses the mark of what we're talking about. Let's just even localize in the context of this comment. Biden wasn't even president when his campaign requested Hunter Biden's nude pics be taken down. Oh, that's all it was. That's the only kind of suppression that happened. They were just worried about the pictures being taken down. It's not like they locked out the New York Post's entire Twitter account and silenced and delisted and deleted any tweets referencing the story. It was just that he wanted to take down the nude pictures. That's all. That's all. And again, to pretend that it's like, oh, he wasn't even president when this happened. It was just, the campaign of one of the most well-connected political families in the entire United States. Again, totally missing the point. And then, again, you end with a nice little whataboutism with Elon Musk, who's done censorship numerous times. Yeah, and I don't like it when he does that either. Sure, that doesn't mean that the concept of free speech is wrong or bad. If anything, what you're saying is free speech is an ideal that is never lived up to. It's just simply a marketing ploy for U.S. audience. But to say it's just a marketing ploy, like, I don't know if he's trying to say that, like, the reality of free speech is a marketing ploy or the ideal of free speech is a marketing ploy. I think if he's saying that the reality of free speech is a marketing ploy, then I'd say, yeah, sure. There are many cases where our free speech is abridged and it is not carried out to its fullest for sure. But none of this makes that point in a way that, or I guess the point of this is if his point with this, which maybe it doesn't miss the mark, if his point is that free speech is hampered on and we should do better, then I'd say, okay, sure, this can all be evidence of that, I guess. But I mean, his Biden remarks are just completely wrong and completely ignoring the actual gravity of the censorship that happened there. So I don't think that an optimistic reading of this is necessarily correct.
Yeah, people, and this is the value of having a principled stance, which is what you had and have on that show, is that, like, yeah, I can freely criticize when a principle is violated by either side, regardless of whether you think I'm on one or the other. So when and if President Trump, strong-handed or tried to apply some strong hand to Twitter to censor things that were against him or censor dissident voices, like, yep, we can fairly criticize that because it violates a principle. We can also do that with Biden, and we're not any worse off for it, right? Like that's the benefit and the clarity that comes with having a principled stance and sticking with it and thinking through things and not being like, not having a principle that is, not having the principle that can be subdued by, I want my team to win. Like our team does not come before the principles that we hold. We're on the team that we think upholds the principles best. And if they don't, then we're free to leave them. The other aspect of this take that's funny to me is, like, people think that, like, it's like his second line, Biden wasn't even president when his campaign requested Hunter Biden's nude pics be taken down. It's like, yeah, so he wasn't president, but all of the entire deep state was rooting for him and wanted him in. It had made it pretty clear that, like, they wanted to make sure that Trump didn't get elected again. And so it's Biden plus the most actual powerful people in the United States government were asking this. And, oh, by the way, Biden, the candidate for the Democratic Congress, which now has the authority to drag the tech CEOs before them and interrogate them, and for 8 hours at a time. And if they don't say what they want them to say, or they get them in a gotcha moment, they can regulate them and make them lose billions of dollars. Like, yeah, that's not a threat. It's like, yeah, there's actual power behind you being politically connected, as you talked about earlier. So it's just funny for people to think that's like, oh yeah, like the guy that sits on the throne is the guy that actually has power. It's like, no, it's actually the guy that has the sword who has the power. And yeah, President Trump has a sword, but it's not the same type of sword as Biden and the Democratic Party and the deep state and everyone pulling together. I mean, Time Magazine, right? Like the cabal that stole the election or secured the election, as they put it, for Biden in 2020. So, these folks will say these things. It's like, yeah, I don't like any of it. I think that, if a platform has a very clear terms and conditions, and they're able to say that, like, hey, we, this specific type of speech, if you say this and say that, or you dox someone to do this, like, we're gonna ban you. Great, like, uphold that. And if there are changes made to it, it's like, it's really clear. It's not dynamic. It's like there's a whole process for it. That's awesome. But what we saw, through the entire thing is that there are certain political actors with a lot of power and a lot of ability to change the destinies of these companies, saying like, hey, you might want to, look into this. We're concerned, about this type of speech, or these vaccine groups, or these, this Twitter user saying this or that. Like, we're really concerned about this, and this is a high priority for us. It's like, yeah, that type of feedback is the one that, like, gets sent to someone and then gets immediately escalated to the top leaders at the company. And they're like, man, the decision we make on this potentially carries whether our company continue existing. And there is no other greater monopoly, no other greater threat that with the snap of their fingers could shut down a company than the United States government. That's the only, in all honesty, it's the only entity in the United States that with the snap of their fingers can decide that a company can't operate anymore. So when that company comes knocking, or not that company, but that entity comes knocking and says, hey, we want you to pay attention to this, like, chances are you're probably going to do so, because your incentives are all aligned with that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you mentioned all of the deep state and all that connection earlier. Not to mention, he's the former vice president.
Yeah.
It's not like he's just it's not like he's Vivek Ramaswamy who's running for, who's the, let's pretend he's the nominee. It's not like he's just the nominee and the head of the party who's in control. He literally was the vice president. Like, he's not just some nobody. It's just such a silly idea to think. But and the other thing is, you mentioned, of course, the clear terms of service, and that was how that there was coercion, because the companies were coming back to the US government for saying, like, no, these don't violate our terms of service. And so then the White House comes back and says, maybe you need to edit your terms of service then, right? That to me is an even more clear violation than saying, hey, take down this tweet because of national security reasons or vaccine hesitancy reasons, whatever you want to say. To me, saying change your terms of service, I think, is actually a much more sinister way, because the government is saying that you have to fundamentally change how you run and how you interpret individual instances, rather than here are some individual instances that we want censored. So I mean, they're both obviously terrible, but the fact that they went, instead of the government saying like, oh, okay, it doesn't violate your terms of service, okay, they come back and say, okay, we'll change your terms of service then. That shows that they're not satisfied to let a business be a business and do its own thing. They're going to enact their will through these businesses. The last thing I would say that I appreciated, Michael Schellenberger, when he's testifying, he always says that, if the courts rule that this kind of thing is okay for a government to do because it's just suggestions, which I don't think it should be, but if they do rule that, then at the very least, we should make a requirement that any kind of request like this is made public. And to me, that is huge. That is so important, right? Because ostensibly, the government derives its power from the people it serves. So if you're not even going to be transparent about the kinds of requests the government is making to private businesses to that, interacts with private citizens, then again, then there's no accountability and there's no real power being derived from the people, again, quote unquote. If you lack that transparency, then there is no authority actually gained from the people. It's just a charade, which I think you and I might maybe agree it already is. But at least putting in a transparency measure there gives us more of this ammo to say maybe we do need to rein back this beast.
Yep, and it's also it incentivizes employees, like, like, hey, I'm not government employees to not do things that could potentially create public uproar. I mean, at least they would truly be serving the people, right? In that way, or not truly, but they would be more aligned with actually serving the people that they are purported to serve.
Exactly right.
All right, let's move on to the next one. This is Alex Karp. He's the co-founder of Palantir Technologies. They're like a big data AI outcomes company. And this is a quote from him, and it reads, "I am not a legislator, but I am running one of the coolest companies in the world. And I'm telling young people, you are breathing the vapors of a dangerous, fake, and self-destructive religion when you are sitting at your elite school pretending because you watched TikTok twice and got an A+ on some crazy paper because your professor couldn't get a job anywhere else, that you actually understand the world. You're not welcome at my company." What do you think about that?
It's kind of based. I mean,
it's really good.
Yeah.
Palantir is not a very freedom-friendly company, but
no, it's not.
It's very based, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, there's probably some level where I'm like, okay, well, you know, it's funny because this guy's coming from a very wealthy to-do school and things like that. But the reality is he's absolutely right, which is, I think, more than ever before, people feel entitled and they feel like they know how the world works in such a way like never before, because there is access to so much information at any given time. But having access to information does not give you the experience to be able to understand and process that. And the more confident you are that something is true, the younger you are, probably the less likely you've experienced it for a good amount of time. I think about the bell curve about sort of, you know, when you start learning something and at the bottom you're like, I know nothing, and then you learn a little bit about it and you jump up to the top of the bell curve, you're like, I know everything about this. And then when you reach the point where you're actually kind of an expert on that, you go all the way back down, you're like, there's so much more for me to learn, I know basically nothing, right? And it feels like we are accelerating students into the I know everything portion, and then they just kind of stay there and they never actually get deeper to realize that there's a lot of depth to things beyond what they know specifically. And so the problem is, I think that in particular with TikTok, because one of TikTok's great strengths is its algorithm and knowing what people want to see and picking up on things like that, I think TikTok is a lot more prone to put people in echo chambers. And so when you think you know something and then you see content that affirms that and doesn't move you beyond that, doesn't have you questioning and challenging your thoughts, and then you feel, you know, motivated to post your own content there that affirms the same thing, because it becomes tribalistic and, you know, oh, this is how the world works, and, you know, all my experience indicates this, therefore there's no other reality. Then you end up with a bunch of people affirming each other, they don't move on, and then they come in to industries where reality is reality. Apart from your lived experience, reality, you know, exists, and they feel like reality has to conform to their perception rather than them conforming to what reality is. So I think he's absolutely right, and I think he's totally based here. Maybe it's a little hyperbolic in some senses, but I think for the most part he's spitting.
I really like it. I think it was Elon Musk talked about how, like, ideas are cool, but execution is worshipped. And that the problem with students that go to class and get a certification is that, unfortunately, the certification, the paper, the degree means less and less. It used to mean that you could execute on things. And it was because college was traditionally something that people that had already been executing successfully went and did so that they could further execute even better. And so people kind of took it as like, okay, if you have a college degree, that's a track record of execution. But now it's not. It's something that you just do. You get a loan for right out of high school to go do, and you get a stamp without any sort of real world generation of value. Because at the end of the day, that's what really, really matters is, can I actually generate value? And it made me think of two things. One was when I was doing our startup, we were a team of 6, and then we had 14 like contractors and stuff. We're lean. So everyone does something, and we can tell everyone how much money we generate for the company or what value we generate for the company that allows us to stay on. And I remember I had this kid that I knew in college, and he came to me saying, "Hey, I want to join your team and be part of it." I was like, "Okay, that sounds good. Like how much do you need to get paid?" And he named a figure. I said, "Okay, like how are you going to justify us paying you this much money? And he's like, I don't know. Like, I was hoping you would tell me, what the job is. Like, nope, that's not how that works. Like, how it works is you have to come to me and say, hey, if you pay me, whatever this amount of money is, I'm going to generate 5x that. If you can't do that at a startup, you're not going to get a job. But that was the problem with someone graduating college and having these certifications and getting an A+ and everything and having this and that scholarship and everything. It's that they think like, well, I already did the work. I got all these good grades and all this stuff, and everyone patted me on the back. And the entire bubble that I'm involved with, how I measure my actual execution, is not based in reality. It's a simulation in college. And so when they get there, they don't actually know how to justify it because we're now into the real world. And then the other example of this, and we've done this on our Cringe Post podcast segment, but I was in a debate about abortion, and someone this is on Facebook, and this gal commented saying like, literally no biologist believed that life begins at conception, and that's just not true. There was a survey done, and I produced a paper that showed that like 98% of biologists agree that human life begins at conception, and that the life that occurs when conception occurs can be classified as human. And in the introduction of the research paper, they have to kind of lay out that like why they were doing this research is like they had quotes from Joe Biden, they had a quote from Donald Trump, and they had various other left and right leaning places to kind of lay out like, hey, this is a central tenet or central argument that needs to be sorted out if we're going to get to the bottom of whether we should be pro-life or pro-choice. And so, anyways, if you know anything about a research paper, if you include a quote from someone, you have to cite that person in the citations. So it's like, hey, this Donald Trump was talking to National Review or something. It had him cited in National Review. And this person said, oh, I'm not going to trust a research paper that cites Donald Trump, in the bibliography. And I was like, lady, like, it's just referring to the quote in the introduction. Look at the actual data tables of the 40,000 biologists that they surveyed. 98% of them, show this. And she's like, oh, no, I would know. I know how to read a research paper. I'm studying to get my doctorate in biology. It's like, well, your biology doctorate is worthless then because you clearly don't know how to read any of it. Like, even read a paper. How can I trust anything else you've read in your entire field of study if you can't even differentiate between, a quote that has no bearing on the actual data of the research or a quote that actually sets the stage of what type of thesis is trying to be proven? And that's the type of people that are graduating from these companies. And what's beautiful about startups and about unicorn technology startups is that they have to make money and everyone has to generate value. And so it forces founders and executives and managers to make really tough calls, but calls that, sort out the people that don't actually pull their weight per se.
Yeah, and on just like an even smaller scale than that, like there's a reason why all of the sort of headline making restaurants that try to do sort of leftist principled ideas of again, you wrote a brilliant paper that got an A+ about how Marxist ideologies would make the workers better and how everything would be sustainable. And then when you try to open a business under Marxist ideologies, it just doesn't work because the costs and the profit don't line up, right? So it's not even just it's like the more in reality and the less connected with corporation, big government, that kind of sort of like I would say that big government and big corporations that are connected to government, they suspend reality in more ways because there's this sort of slush fund that taxpayer and Federal Reserve printing can provide that gives you essentially robbing power of people who are producing things in order to keep your particular pet projects afloat, regardless of their efficacy. And so all of those kinds of college papers that get A+, when you try to apply them maybe to businesses that deal with a little bit more of the brass tacks of reality, they don't often hold up.
It's really hard to make money. It's like, and when I say make money, like make a profit. I remember one of our guys had a van stolen that was outfitted with tools and everything in it. And it's like, yep, that's easily, $80,000. And when you look at the scale of a business that maybe generates $5 million a year, it's like, okay, that doesn't seem like much, but like, you don't realize that $80,000 to make up $80,000 in profit is insanely hard anywhere, no matter what you're doing. And that's the true measure. Like you see a lot of these companies that like, they get VC funding and they get like you were talking about the slush fund from the government, and they get money printed and given to them. And it's like, oh yeah, we've got no runway or whatever. We got runway for X amount of months to to make a profit, and then they just raise more funding, and they're able to spend hundreds of millions of dollars and not generate a single dollar in profit. It's like, yeah, they're not living in reality. And it's a really rude awakening for all of the investors that are not government oriented when that occurs. But the reality of the matter is, right, it's like, it's so hard to actually generate value in excess enough that everyone can take a profit and feels like they're a winner at the end of it. That's why companies that are truly profitable are very, very rare, especially in our modern day.
Exactly.
All right, moving on to our last one. We've got a Cenk Uygur tweet, and he's quote retweeting someone who's writing about a GOP bill. The first tweet writes, the GOP bill to repeal the estate tax would give $1.8 trillion to billionaires, $98 billion to Elon Musk's family, $66 billion to Bezos' family, and the list goes on. And Cenk writes, this is what class warfare looks like. The wealthy use their bought politicians to extract as much wealth as possible and never pay their fair share. Serving the rich is the whole point of the Republican Party. What do you think, Donnie?
Like this sentiment could be expressed on so many better examples than this. Like, if you were talking about bailing out banks, if you were talking about bailing out industries, if you were talking about funding the government through all these deficits, but while you're still giving advantages to corporations and corporate welfare, then I would be like, yep, you're absolutely right. Let's go. When you're talking about cutting estate taxes, then yeah, it's going to disproportionately affect people who own real estate
assets. Yeah.
True. Sure. But that doesn't necessarily imply that this is something that does not benefit the poor. In order to hold that frame of view, you have to think, one, our government is disproportionately benefiting the poor, which it is not, right? The government in its current form, when it has money, spends it in ways that benefit corporations and themselves. And so that your premise is already kind of flawed. And two, you have to think that this kind of like taking the money away from the government in this way not only is taking away money from programs that would be benefiting poorer individuals, but that the tax cut itself does nothing to aid poorer people, which it absolutely does. If you cut real estate taxes, that makes the real estate industry have the ability to lower prices across the board. You know what that means? That means cheaper housing. You know what the biggest cost to the lower and middle class people that is like the most prohibitive cost is housing costs. They are by far the number one expense that people are going to spend on. So if you're doing something that decreases taxation, which means that property owners who have buildings that are going to be out for rent, that means they can lower their rent prices. It means that when you are a builder and you want to build a house on land, it means it's going to cost less to do that. And so the overall price of home ownership goes down. It helps out people disproportionately in the lower areas there. So yes, there may be a lot of money that flows and saves into the upper echelons of society. But even if none of that money saw its way down into the system, which when you have more productive people being productive with money, when you have real wealth being able to be lent out to other people, those are all good things. But even if that wasn't true, you still would see rippling effects from tax cuts that affect everyone down the line in a beneficial way. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Taking money away from our government is disproportionately helping lower income people because right now the government does serve the wealthy. It's just the connected wealthy who are basically trying to tip the scales. And then you have that revolving door of government officials into lobbyists. And you know, they sort of feed themselves and each other and the corporations that are, not playing in a free market scenario. They're the ones who are benefiting from our current system of government. So if you're robbing our government, if you're depriving our government of money, you're depriving that system money, which is a good thing.
Yeah, this take is like so close to being right, but the little amount that it gets wrong just makes it incredibly wrong, which is so unfortunate. Like his last bit about serving the rich is the whole point of the Republican Party. It's like, yes. And also, it's also the entire point of the Democratic Party. And the whole point of having a Republican and a Democrat Party is that the Republicans can appeal to, the moral virtues, quote unquote, of the right. And then the Democrat Party can appeal to the bleeding hearts. And they use both of those appeals to bleed you dry of your money and give it to the people that they want to give it to. So maybe maybe neither of them should be in power, and an individual should be able to make that choice. And oh, do you know what helps enable individuals to have more control over their destiny? Repealing the estate tax, because now all the money that an individual, and I know that this doesn't necessarily apply, this doesn't apply to most people. I think it's like $10 million or something like that. That's the cutoff for the estate tax. But regardless, like people and families that have been able to amass wealth on assets that they already paid taxes on, with money that they earned that was already taxed through wages and all this stuff, let them decide where that money is going to go without them having to give money to a government that is just going to reallocate it to other rich friends. That's really all that this is doing. And so it's just unfortunate, because it's like, Cenk is just a useful idiot. Like, he's so close to getting it right. Like, there is a great injustice going on. Like, it's really clear that this injustice is taking money from the least of us and giving it to people that don't need it and that are getting it through ill-gotten gains. Sure, I'm on board with that. But like, you get it's not even like, it's like you show up to the doctor and like, you're like, oh man, like I'm super convinced that I've got an ulcer in my stomach and that's why I'm coughing up blood. And the doctor's like, no, you've got cancer. I need to give you chemotherapy. It's like, oh, like all you care about is enriching, the big pharmaceutical companies and all this stuff. It's like, no, like, I'm not a big fan of the pharmaceuticals, by the way, but it's like, no, we're trying to actually just diagnose the actual problem here. We don't have an agenda. It's like, yeah, let's just let people do what they're supposed to do. Let the market be healthy. Let it actually have people who have made good decisions with their money, which is how you generate and create and upbuild to an estate. Let them decide where that money is going to go. Let them reinvest it. Let them keep some of it. What a novel idea. The money that you earn, you should be able to keep. And it's always funny because you see like these people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and all these guys, people that are worth like a collective $100 million together, and own multiple houses and experience a strata of wealth that you and I and basically all of the other Americans in our circle will never experience. They're the ones lecturing about how we need to raise taxes in this and that way. It's like, yeah, man, like, forgive me if I don't believe you, and I don't believe that you actually have our best interest in heart. Like, your actions say more than what your actual words. And to quote someone that we just quoted already on this podcast, they care only about looking good, not actually doing good. They actually do evil.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this is that I think Cenk really undermines his own position and makes it harder for people to come around and see this, because when I see a take like this and I see what he is referring to, I just instinctively want to reject the entire premise.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, if you're saying that tax cuts, which are, are the specific thing that is going to cause this corruption and I don't know. I just think that you're aiming incorrectly. It'd be like, highlighting a video of a police officer like shooting a drugged out homeless person attacking a child at a playground and saying like, oh my gosh, police brutality is such an issue. It's like, maybe pick the instance where like you might have a point and people will come around to see. Don't pick the instance when like something good is actually happening, right? Because even if the real estate tax is done in a corrupt way, to me it's like anything that's cutting government spending and decreasing the amount of revenue the government is going to receive is a good thing, even if it's not done perfectly. I don't think the government can do anything perfectly. So let's gut and fillet and slice off every bit we can, and hopefully we can just keep that trend going. But I think overall, no one who's conservative or liberty oriented and leaning is going to look at this and think maybe he's got a point. Maybe the government structure is meant to serve itself, and that all this is doing is extracting wealth for themselves. Like, no one's going to look at that who's like Republican conservative and be convinced to think that maybe Republicans are in on this. They're not going to think that when they see this. All he's doing is throwing red meat to his base with just a particularly poor example, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yep. I don't have any more unless you do.
Nope. I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for hanging out with us, and we'll catch you on the next one.